Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here. I know you just got out of lunch, so I'll try to be entertaining enough that you don't fall asleep. I'm Genevieve Wood. I'm with the Heritage Foundation, where I'm a senior fellow in communications. But we were just laughing. I was talking with Gordon. I've been at Heritage for about 9 years, which is longer than I've been everywhere. But I've worked for, I feel like, almost every other conservative group in the D.C. area. So I have to stay at Heritage because there's really nowhere else to go now after that. My background is primarily in communications. I have done a lot of work in terms of television world, radio world, and public speaking. And so what I want to do here today, and this is really kind of a workshop, which is walk through, it's called Effective Communication Techniques. These should be techniques that are helpful to you, whether it is you're preparing a public speech or a presentation, or you're getting ready to do a television interview, or you're getting ready to do a radio interview. All of these should be applicable things to anything you're doing in the communications arena. Please feel free to stop me along the way and ask questions. I'm happy to do that. Don't wait till the very end. If you've got a question about something I'm talking about, feel free to just jump right in and get going. One thing I want to do is put up my email address. I encourage you to take some notes along the way, but if you would like a copy of the presentation, I'm happy to email this to you. So if you email me, I will email you the presentation. And it's a PowerPoint presentation, but I don't have video in it, so it's easy to, it's not too large of a file to send. If you have any trouble with email, that's also my office line right there, and I'm happy to chat with you afterwards, or if you had trouble getting through to me on email. All right, well, basically I'm going to first start off talking about messaging. And I think message is really kind of where you start with any communications you're doing. Television, speech, whatever it happens to be, the first thing you want to know is, what am I trying to say? And I think there's really 4 steps to a better message. The first is message targets. So we're going to talk about the importance of knowing who your audience is, who you're talking to, and how to kind of think through that logically. Everybody's not the same. No matter what the arena is, what the audience is, it matters who's in the room, who's outside the room. We'll talk about that. There's basically 4 ingredients that I think every message ought to try and incorporate. We'll go through what each of those are. I'm going to give you some outlines and models that I think help you frame your message and shape it. One of the challenges I've always found in anybody I've ever worked with, especially in the kind of public policy community, social policy community, is people are experts in their fields and they know a lot about their topics. And the challenge becomes, how do I decide out of everything I know, what do I share with the audience as opposed to just burying them in facts? So this is kind of a way that will help you kind of organize that material, to think through it in terms of maybe you're doing a 5-minute interview, but what if I wanted to take that and turn it into a 30-minute speech? So I'll kind of give you some mapping outlines for that. And then finally, we'll talk about the delivery side, the fun stuff of what you should wear, how you should use your hands, how you should project your voice, and all those types of areas. All right, let's start first with targeting. My first sound effect. There's basically 3 audiences. The first audience is what I would call the immediate audience. Who would be the immediate audience today? Yeah, you guys in the room. Then there is a secondary audience. Who might be a secondary audience? People that you'll tell about it, that's right. Anybody else? Let's say there was a reporter in the room and they were covering my remarks and they were going to go, this camera for example right here, and somebody was going to take part of what I said and put it in a newspaper article or run a soundbite from what I said that night on the evening news. That would be a secondary audience. But the main thing you want to remember is, who is my target audience? And that's because oftentimes we have a tendency just to speak to the people that are right in front of us. Now sometimes that may be your primary audience. You guys are my primary audience today. But there are times when you're giving a presentation, for example, think of there was a debate I heard last night. I didn't get to watch it because I was on a flight. But the folks up there on that stage were not just trying to reach the people in that room or the moderators. They were trying to reach past all of them to the people who were sitting in their homes last night and watching it. So you have to really think about, who am I truly trying to reach? And that's not just true when you're doing a public speech or a debate, but it's also true when you're doing a one-on-one interview. You're sitting down with a reporter, whether it's a newspaper reporter, a television reporter, and there can be a tendency, I have been there myself, to want to convince that reporter of my issue and that I'm right and my points are right. That's not really who I'm trying to convince. I'm trying to reach the people that are going to read that reporter's story, they're going to see their blog post on it, they're going to see their TV report on it. That's who I'm trying to reach, and that's really important to keep in mind because it can change how you say what you're saying and what you say. I'll remember I was doing a interview, this was several years ago when I worked for the Family Research Council, and I was doing a debate on NPR. This is something called Justice Talking. It was a show that was syndicated around the country. And it was about an hour and a half long debate. I was on the topic of the definition of marriage. And they took that hour and a half debate and they cut it down, so they went from 90 minutes to about 60 minutes. There was a live audience there. This was in Philadelphia, and it was on a very cold night in Philadelphia with a lot of snow out. And there was a live audience that the NPR folks had said, we're going to recruit, the college Republicans and the local family groups and all the folks, the people that will be supportive of your side, and then we'll be your debate partner, and we'll have people there from their side as well. Well, when you have a lot of snow and you're in downtown Philadelphia, a lot of families don't show up in the middle of the week. A lot of folks don't show up. And I remember looking at the audience right before the debate got started, and I'm like, I don't see one person out there that looks like they're going to be on my side of this issue. And, that's a little nerve-wracking. But what I try to remember to myself, especially as I would be presenting and you would have hissing going on in the audience, that was that the people that are listening to this in Salt Lake or in Kansas or in Texas or New York or wherever they were, they didn't know what that audience looked like. All they knew was what I was saying. And I had to keep reminding myself, that's who I'm talking to. Don't get mad at the people down here who are, making noises. Don't get defensive. Keep a positive speech because that's what you want to convey to the people that are listening. So again, with your audience, yes, it is about, am I trying to reach women? Am I trying to reach families? Am I trying to reach people at the base? Or am I trying to reach new folks? But it's also think about where they are. And I think this is a good way to think through it. Next thing you want to do once you know who your audience is ask yourself, what is your audience's view of you? Before you ever step into the room or step onto the stage or they see you on television, what do they think about you just by who you are, or by who your employer is, or by what position you're about to represent? You want to ask yourself, what do people already think about me? Now sometimes it's a positive thing. They like your organization, maybe they already agree with your point of view, they like you as a person perhaps, and in those cases you want to reinforce the positive things that they think about you. But sometimes what they think about you is negative from the get-go. And you want to think about how are ways that I can go about not reinforcing the negatives and overcoming those with positives. So you have to know, and I have these two folks up here because my experience has been as I've done a lot of things, political debates, right versus left, Republican versus Democrat, and so forth. A lot of times people, when they think of a conservative, they think of which one up here? Angry. Not Santa, no. Santa is the people that we probably saw a few weeks ago at the other debate where they're giving out free things. But I say, with the left and the right, here's one of the challenges is that, oftentimes the left, they've always got something to give out. It's not going to cost you anything, and it's always somebody else's fault, and so forth. They get to be the friend, if you will, whereas a lot of times conservatives come along and say, no, this is why we need to do it this way. This is why in the long term this will be better for the country, better for you as a person. You get to be the parent. That's tough sometimes to overcome those things, but if you think about it in advance, it can change your demeanor. It's why I'll talk about why it's so important to smile. It's hard to hate people that are smiling at you. It may not change their position, but it may soften them to your position. It may open up their mind just a little bit. So think about what is your audience's view of you. We are on the eve of Halloween, so I have this little graphic here. Talked earlier about when you're an expert on a topic, you know so many things that you could use to try to convince people of your particular position. How do you get all that stuff out? How do you come down to the one or two messages you really want to focus on? And I came up with something called the obituary test because I was working in a place once and I was thinking of what I wanted to do next, what kind of field I should go into, what kind of organization I should work for. And one of the folks who was my mentors there said, Genevieve, you ought to sit down and write your own obituary. I thought, that's a very morbid exercise. Why would one want to do that? But it's actually a very good suggestion. He said, you want to sit down and write out, what do you want people to remember about you as a person? And chances are it won't be, this particular title, or it will be, what did this person do, right? And that can really help you think about, what do I want to do with my life? And I thought, that's also a very good way to think about your message. You know, when you are dead and gone as a messenger, when they have thrown away the newspaper that had your great quote in it, or they've hit delete on the email that had your article in it, or the TV show or the radio show's over that you were just on, what would be the one thing you wanted your audience to remember about what you said? Of all the things they could know about your particular issue set, what would be the one thing you really want them to be able to walk away and tell somebody else who wasn't listening? And that's your number one talking point. And if you do that exercise a second time and a third time, you get point 2 and point 3. And you often hear people say, you know, go into an interview with 2 or 3 main talking points and try to stick to those. That's a way of helping you get to that particular point. All right, message ingredients. Talked about there were like 4 ingredients that I thought every message ought to try and have. Well, this is what I call the message formula. So M stands for message. Then we have 1 E and 3 C's. The E stands for emotion. And by emotion, I mean, what is it you want your audience to feel as they're either hearing you present, or they're watching your interview, or they're reading about your particular position? Do you want them to be outraged? Do you want them to be happy and excited? Do you want them to be scared, concerned? What is the emotional element that you're trying to pull? Because that will help you to think about the examples that you use and how you as a presenter actually present them. And then there's 3 C's. The first C, I would say, is similar to emotion, but it's not quite the same, which is called connection. How does it connect with the audience that you're trying to reach? There's a lot of policies that we talk about, marriage policy, adoption policy, I mean, you name the issue. But until people really understand or have a sense of how it personally affects them or somebody that they care about, they might agree with you, but they're not going to be motivated to do that much about it. So you want to think about, how is what I'm talking about something that really connects? What could be the examples I use that really connect this message to the audience members I have in front of them? The second C would be what I call credibility. What about you as a messenger is credible? I was doing some media trainings yesterday and the day before with some state lawmakers from around the country. One was from Utah. Down in Orlando at a conference, and one of the topics that they deal with, this particular group deals with a lot, is how to improve foster care in their different states, and what regulations they should get rid of, and how they should open it up to more of the private sector and so forth. And one of the women that I was interviewing, she was doing a great job, and we were doing like mock interviews, and then we would play the video back. And probably 5 minutes into the interview, she brings up the fact, because I didn't know it, I hadn't read her bio, I didn't, as most reporters, by the way, and so forth, people don't, when you come on TV or they see an interview, they don't know your background, right? They just kind of know your name and title. Well, 5 minutes into the interview, she mentions the fact that she has been a foster care mother, and she's really seen how the system works, and I thought, okay, that makes you so much more credible than just an elected official talking about how you want to change the laws. You can now be able to say, I've been there, I've seen children go through this. As a parent, as an advocate for these kids, I've seen what it's like to work in these systems. That makes her so much more credible to your average person. It's like somebody who's in healthcare. If they've been a nurse, if you've been a patient, you've got some skin in the game that maybe some other people don't have. And you want to always find ways to work that in, if you possibly can. It's easy when you're speaking to make sure that you actively do it, but even when you're doing an interview, maybe next to your title you'd want to tell the reporter, yeah, I'm the communications person for Family Research Council, but by the way, I've also had 2 foster kids come through my home. That's something they should know for that story, and hopefully that they would include it, because it just makes you a more credible messenger. And then finally, the third C is contrast. Anybody want to guess what I mean by contrast and how a message should have that?
Contrast as in compare and contrast?
Yes, exactly.
Sometimes you can clearly articulate what you're trying to say by saying what it's not, or painting the picture of the opposite. Anyway, that can sometimes add focus.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that people rarely do, they can become very good at expressing their side of an issue, which is important, that's number one. But sometimes you need to really be prepared to write out the other side, as I would call it. Contrast what's different about what you're saying and what the other folks are saying. And I think most recently about some of the Planned Parenthood debates that we've seen of late, I don't think that they've been completely honest about what they've been doing. I think it's really important that it's pointed out, no, here's actually what your organization does. Here's actually how they are spending their money. You can't rely on your debate opponent, whether it's a formal debate or a TV debate, to tell all the things that don't make them look very good. You may have to be the one to do that. And that doesn't mean you spend your whole time doing it, but you need to be prepared to make sure the public really knows what are the holes in their argument and what are the negative sides of what they're presenting. So be prepared to do the contract side. Any questions about any of the ingredients? Credibility, contrast?
What was the first one?
The first one was E stood for emotion. C was connection.
Connection.
Yes. And I'm going to put up in a minute about 6 questions that kind of helps summarize some of this. Yes.
On the contrast, obviously you want to point out the holes and the negative aspects, but does it give you more credibility if you also point out where you have in common, and so that they see you not as just attacking, but look, I understand where they're coming from, but this is why they're wrong.
I definitely think you can do that. Especially, I mean, look at something like the healthcare debate. I don't think everybody, at least not everybody, who is for kind of the government doing more in healthcare wants to destroy our healthcare system. I just don't believe that. I think some may. But I think most of them, they just have different views of how to go about getting to the answer. And I think that's true of most people that are in the political space, the policy space. They all want to help. It's just they have different ways of how they think would be the best way to do it. And I think acknowledging that up front is totally fine, and it can be a very good thing to do. But I just would want to make sure that that's maybe the first kind of thing you say, and then you go into, having said that, here's why I think their plan or their policies don't work. Or this is just what you should know. If you support this, you should know you're also supporting this and this. Because we can all support good health care for women, for example. But that doesn't mean that, and many people I think who supported Planned Parenthood in the past thought that's what they were doing. But then you say, but you're also supporting this and this, just know that. And all of a sudden you've seen the percentage numbers of their support go take a fairly sharp dive over the last few months, because a lot of people have learned things they just didn't know. Any other questions about this one? All right, let me do something I call the image pyramid. I mentioned earlier, you don't want to just bury people in facts, but I do think facts are very important. Where you want to start when you're thinking about your message and the emotion, the image you want to leave with people, you start at the top of the pyramid with that. What are the images I want people to come away with? What's the emotion I want them to feel? But then you take the facts that you have, not 20 of them, but a couple of them to back them up. And so your message is not just an emotional one. It's not just a passionate one, as important as that is. You're also conveying to your audience, you actually have the evidence to also back that emotion up. Yes.
How would you do that if you're arguing a point that it's not necessarily good to have statistics behind it, you're just kind of going through a logical, because this policy will create this, that's not in the fallacy way of A to Z, but just saying kind of this is what it's going to lead to, and kind of reasoning through a process. How would you balance the facts with that? Because there's not always going to be statistics saying this is going to happen because maybe it's never happened before.
Right, right. Well, I think as best you can, you try to find something that says, we've tried this before, maybe not in this country, or maybe not in this state, maybe not in this community, but we've seen elements of this in other places, and here was a direction that it took us, which was either a positive or a negative thing. And again, you may not always have one for every single point you make, but where you can, I just think it's a good thing to be able to back up. And when you do use facts, whether it's statistics, whether it's survey or poll numbers, always be able to cite your source. One of the easiest ways to discredit somebody is saying, I've never seen that source. I've never seen that poll. Where'd you get that? And the person can't answer it. All of a sudden, you kind of look like you may be making it up. So if you're going to use numbers or statistics, be sure to know you can back it up with a good source.
So,
Yes.
I'm not sure that I'm fully understanding this particular graphic. So you say build the image, start at the top, then you're thinking message, image, emotion. I understand image, emotion. What do you mean by image?
So, for example, what is the, it could be a story that you told. What's the image you're wanting to leave people about a particular topic? Or you want to leave them with the picture that this is a good policy for children. You want them thinking in those kind of pictures and ways. You want to leave, that's what you want at the top. But then the bottom is then just using data, not a lot, but some, to help back that up.
So start with your end point that you want to leave
That's
them
right.
with, kind of back it up with facts.
That's right.
And then return
Because
to,
most people
then return to reiterate your main point.
That's right, because most people, and thank you for clarifying, most people who know a lot about a topic, they want to start with the facts. And I don't mean just to build their foundation in the way they talk. Did you know this many people in this many states? And you might be very right, but I have my time in the political arena about 21 years, for better or worse, arguing a lot of different issues, economic policy, social policy. So I can tell you that if I thought that facts would win the day, I think my side would have won a long time ago. But here we are, 21 years later, having the same battles, same old stuff, and it's because people, you all know this when you see how people vote. Come on in, folks, it's time. I heard on the news this morning that the #1 search that people did on Google about the candidates in both parties, Republicans and Democrats, the 13 leading folks, was how tall is so-and-so?
How tall?
How tall? Not, what is so-and-so's tax policy? What does so-and-so want to do on health care? The #1 Google search for all of them, percentage-wise, was how tall is so-and-so.
It's still a fact, though.
It is a factor, and so I was just going to say, so we can all go, that's ridiculous, and it doesn't matter. Well, okay, that's fine, but it does matter to people and how they perceive things. It's totally true. Usually the tallest person on the stage wins.
Yeah.
And people go, well, we've had short people before for president. I'm not disparaging short people, so anybody who's shorter than I am, I'm not saying. But it matters. And television, they go back to the old. You probably heard this, the Nixon-Kennedy debate. And Kennedy, it was black and white TV, but Kennedy looked youthful and energetic, and Nixon, who even when he shaved, didn't look like he had shaved. He just had this dark look, and he looked tired. And Nixon won. People who watched it say, yeah, Nixon may have won it. People listening to the radio thought Nixon won, but people who watched on television thought Kennedy won. So that shows you how much visual, and I'll talk a little bit about that, how people actually perceive you and how important visual is. Okay, the 60-30-10 rule, and this again kind of comes into, I'm sure all of you do things that sometimes involve giving speeches, sometimes involve just doing press interviews, and this kind of helps you think through, okay, how do I not have to completely rewrite my message for every single thing that I do? And this is what I call the 60-30-10 rule. Most of the time for a speech, if you have several kind of 60-second paragraphs you put together, you can give easily a 5 to 10 minute stump speech, right? Or longer if necessary. A short answer is what I call 30 seconds. This is the kind of thing you probably ought to be trying to do on radio, right? Radio will let you go a little bit longer. Sometimes they'll even let you go 60 seconds. When you're doing a TV interview, and I don't necessarily mean live interviews. In live, you can get away with a little bit longer answers. But if you're interviewing with a reporter and they're going to go back to the station and take out part of what you said and put it into a story, you're not going to get more than about 7 seconds usually. So you want to be able to get your message down to something really short. And what I did is I went back and picked out something from President George W. Bush. This was the State of the Union back in 2006, and this was a debate over stem cell research. I don't know if you all we were having a debate over embryonic stem cell research back at this time. And this was a 60-second statement that he made from his State of the Union on that topic. And again, for some of you who came in later, I'm happy to email you this PowerPoint, and I'll give you my email address. If anybody has to leave early, I have business cards up here, and you can just take one and email me, and I'll send it to you. So you don't have to write all this down. But so I took this 60, I said, okay, how would I turn this in to 30 seconds? What if I only had 30 seconds to say the same kind of thing? And this is more of a 30-second version. And I clipped just some of the words that he used in a few of the sentences and got it here. And then I said, okay, well, what if I only have 10 seconds? I've got to have a very succinct soundbite that I can use that's going to make it on the evening news or what have you, or that a reporter might use in their story. They don't quote people you don't usually get paragraphs and stories. And then you cut it down to a 10-second. And you have it here. And so what I tried to do with the 10 was get down to the very basis of what he was trying to say, added a little more for each one of the other questions, but it was one statement that I basically just made a shorter version of and another shorter version of to get to that point. And again, I think if you do this exercise, if you know, people say, do I have to write it all down? I think it's a great place to start. You know, you have your written out 60 and then you get it to a 30 and then you go down to a 10. The more you do this, the more, I think the easier it becomes for you to do that kind of editing, if you will, on the fly when you're in an interview. So every time you do something, you don't have to do this exercise, but it's a good way to kind of start training your mind to think in terms of how do I edit pieces and how do I pull out pieces of a larger body of work. Okay, let me give you 6 questions that kind of sum up a lot of what we've talked about here. One is, what do you want your audience to remember? And that's the OBIT test that I talked about earlier. Start off, that's when you're putting your message together, kind of go through these 6 questions. What is it you want your audience to remember? 2, what does your audience know about you, or what should they know about you that gives you more credibility as a messenger? And again, I mentioned, this is the kind of thing when you're speaking somewhere, you know, many of you may have if you work for an organization that they post bios and so forth on the website. I oftentimes will give whoever's going to introduce me, I'll give them the 2 or 3 sentences I want them to use to introduce me, as opposed to them printing out my full page bio from Heritage and them picking out what they want to say. It's all fine stuff, but depending on what I may be talking about that night, I might want to pull out certain elements of it. So if you're speaking somewhere, make sure that they know something that's important about you that really connects you to the topic you're talking about. Number 3, what defines my position, or as we talked about, what maybe defines my opponent's position. And when I say opponent, it doesn't always have to be somebody who you're debating in the room or that you're debating on a radio show. It just may be that you're doing an interview and you know they're going to talk to somebody from the other side. And so you want to make sure the reporter knows, here's some elements from the other side. Another trick on that, when you're doing interviews or you're going into a media, let's say you're doing a live TV or radio show, always ask who the other person is. I'm amazed at how many people go into an interview and they never ask who's on the other side of the debate. Or if you're just talking to a print reporter, chances are they're going to talk to other people. I always ask, who else are you talking to on this? And the main reason I do that is to help me know, what are they going to be hearing from these other people? And most of the time, it's an organization I'm maybe familiar with, and if I'm not, I can look them up online. I can see what they've been saying about a particular issue. If it's a politician, it's very easy to kind of see what they've been saying about a certain issue. That may help you decide what your message should be, because you may say, you know what, I know they're going to say this, and I really need to counter it. It may be that it's a group that is complementary to what you're talking about. And so you kind of know where they're going to go, so you may want to add it over here. So just always ask, who else are you talking to? Number 4, what is it I want my audience to feel? Do I want them to come away energized, motivated, angry? What does I want them to feel about, and channel my message through that? This is the connection piece. Are there any examples or pictures I can paint? And I think this, when you're giving a speech, this element is a lot easier because you've got more time to tell a story, to give some examples of how you've seen this work. This is a much larger challenge when you're in a television interview, 10 seconds, or you're doing you're doing a shorter frame thing, but you always just want to think about, what's the image I want people to have in what I'm talking about? But this is good for children, this is good for families. What is it I'm wanting them to think about? This is good for them personally. What am I wanting them to think about here? I think about, do you all remember from the last election cycle? It may have been a 1-minute ad. I can't remember if it was 30 seconds or 1 minute. It was, this is when Hillary Clinton was running against Barack Obama, and she had the 3 a.m. phone call. Do you all remember that ad? The phone rang at 3 a.m. Who's going to answer the phone? That was a great connection piece in a way, because it had people, the image in their mind was, yeah, if something explodes in the world at 3 a.m., who is answering the red phone? That's the image people had. And she wanted people to have the image, you want me answering it, not him. Didn't work, but that was the image that she was going for. And then number 6, will I be able to make all my points in less than 30 seconds? And again, for speeches, that's not as applicable, but for most of the interviews that you would be wanting to do, you want to be able to keep it short and simple. There's a number of acronyms or words you can add to that acronym, but keep it short and simple is usually what I go with. But before you asked any of these questions, what would be the first question that you asked? Before any of the 6 that I put up here on the screen.
I think it would be, what is it that I want my audience to feel, or the examples of pictures I can paint, because we need to have the end result of what we're aiming for before we can.
Well, right, but before you ask that question, any of the 6 questions that I just put up, what would be the question you asked before the image or any of that?
Who is my audience?
Who is my audience? Right, because if you don't know who your audience is, it's kind of hard to decide what are the points I want to leave with them, what is the image I'm trying to paint. And I will tell you, it's, again, if you're somebody who does this very often, or you end up in a communications or a media role and you do a lot of these kind of interviews, it becomes very easy to just kind of do the same thing everywhere. I know, I've done it. I've been very guilty of it myself. And a lot of times it's because I am speaking to a lot of similar audiences. But I could have been more thoughtful in how I really reach some versus others. So it's been really important to go through this exercise and not get lazy about it. It's also important as somebody, when you're doing interviews, if you become very familiar with the subject or comfortable with it, you'll have a tendency just to wing it. Again, I have been very guilty of doing that. And I'll go in and I'll do an interview, like say on Fox, and it's 5 minutes long, debate with somebody. I'll walk out and it went fine. I thought, oh, I should have said X. And nobody at home knows I should have said X. Well, a few people have. But it wasn't that the interview went poorly or that I didn't have good points to make, but I walked away knowing if I'd spent more time thinking about doing that obit test, I would have really made the point that needed to be made as opposed to making a good secondary point. And the reason sometimes you don't do that is because you're familiar with the topic, you kind of think you can wing it, you're busy, I understand. But you will have that experience of walking off the stage or walking out of an interview thinking, I didn't say the one thing that would have been the most important for them to hear. Any questions thus far before we move into outlining your message? Anything about audience? Okay. All right, so I mentioned earlier that I wanted to give you a couple of models that helps you organize your thoughts, whether it's for an interview or whether it's for a larger speech. And I did 2 things. One is a personality, and I picked Al Gore because he's not running. I don't want to offend anybody's candidates. I'm not going to be negative on him. I'm just going to give you this example. Have you all seen Donna Brazile on TV? Do you know who she is? Yeah, she's a commentator on CNN usually. She's usually on a lot of the political shows, and she was an advisor to Al Gore back in the 2000 cycle. And she actually told the New York Times about this, and I thought, well, this is actually really cool. I'm going to borrow that from Donna and use it for other things. They were having a hard time at that point in the campaign of really helping people beyond being Bill Clinton's vice president, defining who Al Gore was. Like, what do people think about when they think Al Gore? Because, yeah, he'd been a senator from Tennessee, but on the national stage, people don't know vice presidents that well. Anybody who watches the late night shows and they go out and interview people asking them who the vice president is, you learn very quickly many Americans have no idea who the vice president is. So Al Gore didn't really have a persona, and they were trying to really figure out what can we put up here that would be the images that we want to leave with people. And here were the 3 things that she talked about. She said, we want people to know that he's a proven leader, that he's a principled fighter, and that he's really got experience. Now, you may disagree or agree that those are things that are true about Al Gore. And frankly, you could say that about anybody running for office would love people to think all those things about them, right? But the way she did it was, she said, look, when we're in an interview, whether it's the candidate himself, whether it's Brazil, whether it's anybody working on the campaign and they're talking to reporters or they're talking to constituents, no matter what issue comes up, what are you guys going to do about the environment? What are you going to do about the Social Security reform? What are you going to do about, I'm trying to think back then, Iraq? Or what are you going to do about these different issues? She's like, whatever came out, we're going to block it with one of these. Al Gore has been a proven leader on the environment. Al Gore has got experience when it comes to Social Security reform. On the Senate, he worked on one of the committees there. Al Gore has been a principal fighter for America's seniors. When it comes to Social Security, nobody will fight harder for them than Al Gore. So you see how that works? No matter what comes out of here, you're hitting it with one of these key phrases. And so the way that I would utilize this is when you're going into an interview. This is not yet for a speech. This is when you're thinking about, I'm going into an interview, and whether it's somebody who agrees with you who's interviewing you, or it's somebody who you think is going to be on the opposite side, you want to think about, no matter what questions they throw my way, I'm going to block with my 3 main points. And where do you get these 3 main points? You've done your obit test 3 times, and you've come up with the 3 messages your audience absolutely ought to walk away with, and that's what these are here. Does that make sense? I'm going to show you how that works when you turn it to an issue in another slide. Okay, so that works well for a short interview, but what if I want to turn this into a 5-minute speech, a 15-minute presentation? What would that look like? And this is something called mapping. Has anybody seen this before? I did not invent this. This has been taught in speech classes and other places. But I've used it a lot personally, and it is very helpful in organizing your thoughts, and it also keeps you from reading a speech. Now, if you're giving a State of the Union or a State of the State, or you're the president of an organization and you're giving the keynote for the organization, you may want to read remarks, practice doing them. But for most speeches that you're doing, you really probably shouldn't be reading it because it's just not as interactive with people. So I would encourage you to think about a model like this or others out there that help you organize your thoughts and then stay on them. Here's how it would work. Okay, so the topic of this speech is Al Gore. And we're going to talk about these 3 elements I mentioned: his experience, he's been a proven leader, principal fighter, and so forth. What these are reminding me is these are the places I want to go, and these are examples that back up the elements that I've made here. So I'm going to talk about Al Gore's experience. I'm going to talk about his role in the U.S. Senate. Now, keep in mind, this doesn't work if you don't know what Al Gore did in the U.S. Senate. So you as a speaker, or whether it's a person or an issue, you have to know your topic matter. This is to help remind you and to stay on track. So you would talk about what he did in the U.S. Senate. He's been a proven leader. Okay, I want to make sure that I talk about his role in the HC task force. That's telling me to talk about the healthcare task force that he worked on. He's been a proven leader when it comes to the environmental causes. So I want to make sure that I have that in there. Principal fighter, I could not come up with any good examples for that, so at this point, but I'm sure Don and others had some. But then I want to leave it take action with people. In this case, I want people to remind them to go vote. I want them to register their friends. I mean, you can think of a lot of different take action elements that you would want to have. But this is something that so many people leave out of a speech. They get people all fired up, ready to go, save the country, fight for this cause, and then they don't tell them what to do about it. And most people don't know what to do about it, right? I mean, people could be ready to throw, shoes at the TV. They can't stand what's happening, but then they just go to bed. They don't naturally go online necessarily and give. They don't necessarily show up at the local precinct and help with elections. They don't show up at your organization and start getting involved in the cause. You really have to give people examples of what they can do and ask them to do it. So don't spend all the time getting them motivated and then not have to take action. Always have to take action at the end. All right, let's look at how this might work for an issue. And I picked the topic of marriage, making the case for marriage. And these were 3 of the, and there's a lot of different things that we could talk about with this issue, and you may have your own. But I came up with 3 saying, if I was going to do an interview, I'm going to talk about why this is best for children, why it's best for society, and why, yes, for everybody out there that thinks this debate doesn't matter, it doesn't affect them if Bob and Joe get married. Yes, it does. So, again, those are 3 points I came up with. You may have others. But if I was doing an interview, these would be the phrases that I'd always want to keep coming back to. What if I wanted to turn this into a 15-minute speech, maybe? Okay, so you go out, you've got your topic in the center, you've got your 3 main talking points with a take action at the end. And then I come in with this. First of all, I want to say it's best for children, and I would want to give a couple of statistics on child stats that back that up. That what's best for children should trump the desires of adults. That's a phrase I'm sure some of you have heard. I'm going to go into the why this is best for society and talk about why the government's even interested in this in the first place. Why does the government care if two people of whatever sex get married or multiple? Why do I care? Why does the government care? Many people don't think about that. Now you've got to know that case and understand how to make it. That's just there reminding me to do that. I want to talk about why marriage between a man and woman is a gold standard for society. You can have a lot of different other kind of relationships and why it's the gold standard for raising children. Use that element. And then go to, by the way, I know a lot of folks out there think, if my neighbors do this and they don't bother, what difference does it matter to me, right? It doesn't affect me. And I want to make the case, it does affect you. In a couple of ways, how? It can affect what your children are taught in schools. When we change laws, it changes what they teach in schools, and you are having less and less control over that. I could give a lot of examples where religious liberty and religious freedom are now under threat because of the fact that we're changing our laws, and I can talk about the bakers in Oregon and the florists in different places. I mean, there's a lot of examples that I could give. Again, I have to know what those are to be able to follow this, but if you know your subject very well, this is just, like I said, keeping you on track. And the other element that I think is nice about this that I found when using it, I may start here and just based on the flow or maybe a question that I get, it makes more sense to go here next. I can easily do that without losing my place and still come back to this and then come back over here. You can go a lot of different ways without losing your train of thought or losing your place in speech. If you've got a 10-page written speech, it's real hard to do that. Even if it's an outline, your papers get shuffled and you've seen people that lose their place in the speech and it gets kind of ugly. So this is a way of helping you organize it and help you move around without losing your speech. Or without losing your train of thought. Any questions or thoughts on this? Yes?
Why pyramid is because people can only remember three things at a time?
Well, the pyramid works well for three. I generally say to people, you can have 5 points in a speech. You can have 5 points you want to make in an interview, but you're wanting people to be able to take what you said and go tell somebody else. There's a big difference between a good presenter and a good communicator. They share some things, but for example, somebody can give a speech and maybe they were really funny and they were energetic and they go out and people who weren't there say, what'd they say? No, this guy was great, he was terrific. What'd he say? I don't know, but he was hilarious. They can't really tell you the substance. And that may be your goal, right? That's fine for some things, but a good communicator is somebody who is also a good presenter, so they were entertaining, they didn't put the audience to sleep, but when the person walked out and somebody said, what did they say? That person could give them a couple of sound bites from what they said. They could communicate 2 or 3 points that they made. And even if you're a good presenter, if you've got too many points, people go out with multiple thoughts. And that can be negative in 2 ways. One, people just overloaded with information. You may have convinced them that you really know it, and you've convinced them with all the data that you're right, but they can't go tell somebody else because there's just too much for them. Or somebody goes out with one message, somebody goes out with another, somebody goes out with this, and you're really wanting people to come out with a similar message, And so I was watching earlier today some analysis of last night's debate, and they were talking about, what's the point of some of these debates? It's only, the base of each party watches. How many Democrats were watching the Republicans last night, and how many Republicans were watching the other folks? But the truth is that one of the elements of those debates is, and Newt Gingrich was making this point, which actually I was agreeing with, you're trying to educate your base because you need your base to go educate others. I say this all the time at the Heritage Foundation. We have about 280 people that work there. We have about 600,000 members around the country. It's up to those, if those people don't go out and do stuff, it's not going to matter what we do in DC. We can do, our goal is to come up with the facts and the research and put it in materials and in ways that other people can take it and go do other things with it and go reach others. And that's what you as a communicator want to do. You want to be able to communicate in a way that people who agree with you are then going to go find people that are never going to hear you speak, that are never going to see your interview. So you want to have a multiply type of effect. Any other questions on this one? Has anybody tried using this before and found it helpful? Yeah?
Just for note taking, actually.
Yeah, it's a great way to do that too. It's organizing. Where are you gonna? Oh, sorry, I thought you had your hand up, that's okay. I've used this a lot with different groups on a whole different set of issues, and a number of people have emailed me, 6 months later, hey, I used that map thing. And it really helped them. So again, you don't have to probably give an hour-long speech off of this, so people like myself who are very verbose, you maybe could. But if you know your topic well, it's just a great way to help you organize your thoughts. Yes?
What is the name of this matrix? How do you refer to it?
Mapping, just a mapping exercise, yeah. And like I said, there's a number of different types of maps and so forth out there. This is just the one that I've always found to be simple and helpful. All right, let's talk about the delivery side. So you now have just, you know who your audience is, you know what you want to say, you've got your 3 points and all these things down. How can I be more effective in my personal delivery? We talked about earlier the height question on Google. Let me just put these numbers all up here. So when you first meet someone, whether you're saying hi and you're introducing yourself, or you're on stage and presenting, or somebody sees you on TV, people give you about, numbers vary, but anywhere from like 4 to 8 seconds is their first impression. So in 4 to 8 seconds, most people very quickly decide, and we all do this, we very quickly decide, do I like what I see? Does that person seem credible? Do they seem friendly? Are they like me? I mean, a lot of these decisions are made very, very quickly. Now, they can be changed, but they're made very quickly. And most of that decision making is based on what people see. 55% of it is based on what they visually see. This is why there are not a lot of ugly news people on television, right? People want to flip through. Vocal, 38% of it is based on not what you were saying, but how you were saying it. So are you coming across yelling? Are you coming across as somebody who's friendly and engaging? What's the vocal that you're using? About 7% of it is based on what you're actually saying. Now, I know for those who care a lot about facts, that is a very disturbing number. And it should be. But the good news is this is the first impression side of it. But it doesn't even matter if people listen to you for 10 minutes. That is still how most people make up their minds in the larger presentation. Not people who already know what they think, not people who already agree or disagree. There's always those you're never going to convince, and there's always those that will always be with you. But the people in the middle who aren't as up to date on the topics, or just, as I say to people, none of you here are normal. If you were normal, you wouldn't be sitting in this room on a Thursday doing things like this. But you're very engaged in the cultural battles and the policy issues, and that's not what most people are spending their time on. And that's okay. People are busy raising their families, working, and so forth. So they don't know as much about the details, and that's why they use a lot of these other elements. And think about the people who are popular, whether it's in politics, whether it's in just popular entertainment. They tend to be people that come across positively. They're likable. I mean, I give the examples of a Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. Their policies were quite different, but they were very similar in their communication techniques. Big smilers, great storytellers. With a few examples, they lost their cool, but most of the time they were very good at maintaining their composure when presenting. So that makes a real difference for people. Most people, they don't want to see angry. They want to see positive. So these are just the main breakout, and we'll talk about how that impacts other elements.
Those numbers, are they from like watching TV or reading them in person? Obviously not radio.
Right, I'm sorry, and you should ask, where's my statistic on this? Where did I get this information from? That's right. This was believe me, it happens all the time. This is from Roper Institute, which does a lot of public opinion surveys. And this is based on first impression data, so it could be somebody watching television, it could be watching somebody on the stage. Didn't matter, it's obviously not radio. They had to have the visual element of it. Speaking of statistics, let me just, especially when you're using these, whether you're verbally using them, or maybe you're wanting to include a graphic with the speech that you're giving, and you've got, something over here that's like trying to make your point, you want to keep things very simple. People have a lot of data on the screen they've got to take in, it's too much. You want to keep it very simple. You also want to keep numbers simple. It's never, 68.9% of people think X. Almost 70% agree with. or, over half. Talk in numbers that, again, people can remember. Not if it's got a decimal point in it, it's probably not what you should be using. So you keep your numbers very simple. And people do love polls. I mean, there's a reason on the TV. It's like every day it's like, what's the latest poll say? It's like, and so many now they're so irrelevant, but people just love to see kind of what the horse race is. But they also like to see where they fit in. This is not just in politics. USA Today, if you've ever noticed at the bottom of the page, they always have some random poll like Americans' favorite hamburgers. It's like, okay, it's interesting. It's not world changing, but there's a reason there's that there every day. That's one of the first places people go that read USA Today on a regular basis. They just kind of like to see who's the #1 movie star this year. I mean, all that stuff people just are interested in. So it's an effective thing to know, and it's an effective thing to include, I think, in your presentations, but you always want to try to keep them simple. Let's talk about gestures. What do I mean by gestures? Hands, facial expressions. This is something the first thing I usually ask people to think about is kind of like, what's your audience, is what will the audience see? So for example, today you're seeing all of me, right? But if I was on TV, you would see usually this much of me, right? Or I might be behind a desk. There's all different elements or different places that it could be. Or you could be on radio and they don't see you at all, which is why your voice matters even more, or even the words that you use can matter even more. But you always want to know what the audience will see. And part of that is because that can tell you how you should use your hands, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But it's also can be how you should dress. I've seen people come into an interview set and they didn't realize that they were going to be on a couch and there was no desk in front of them, nothing else, and they're not dressed appropriately for it. Either they didn't wear matching jacket and pants, or their socks are too short or the wrong color, gentlemen. Or ladies, the skirt is too short, but you thought when you sat down there was going to be something in front of you, and now there isn't. And you don't want to be there. So always ask, what's the set like? Am I going to be behind a podium? Am I going to have a mic that, goes here? Or am I going to have to carry something? You don't want to walk into any of those situations and be surprised, especially when it's a surprise that then throws you off your game. So always ask, what will the audience see? And let me talk about hands very quickly first. One of the reasons you always want to know what the audience will see is because when you're using your hands, it's much different if they're seeing a full body of you, right? But if they're only seeing this much, you can still use your hands, as I've been using them here, but you don't want them up here competing with your face. You want people to be able to focus on your face and what you're saying, not what your hands are doing. So you want to kind of keep your hands at this element, whether you're public speaking or whether you're on television. Yes?
This is a little bit random, but have you ever experienced where the angle of where it cuts off, your hands come in and out of the camera view?
Yeah.
What would you say about that? Because I've noticed that.
Yeah, I think that's why you want to keep them lower, because it can just look weird. I mean, look,
Yeah.
if you're referring to something and you want everybody to know, you're like, I've got this report right here. Okay, then yeah, you want to bring it up, and that's your kind of visual
but when you
element.
see the flash in and out,
It's random. It's just distracting. It's just distracting for people. So, and I don't. That doesn't mean that I think you should sit on your hands, because I'm going to talk about here about facial expressions and energy. Most people do the opposite of what they should do when they get on camera. They take it down a notch. Or when they get in front of a crowd, they tend to become more reserved. And most people need to dramatize their facial expressions and energy by about 25%. Now, if you are a super expressive person naturally, you don't have to do that. But most people I've worked with, they need to do that. And the problem is they do the exact opposite. So again, it's something you have to remind yourself before you go on. Energy, big expressions. I'm going to talk about smiling, a real smile. I taped a lot of interviews. I was telling some of you yesterday with some state legislatures, and I said, legislators, smile when you're talking. It just makes you more reachable with the audience, personable. Okay, we do the interview, we'd play it back. No, not smiling. And he's like, I thought I was smiling. I'm like, I know you thought you were smiling, but you're not smiling. And it's something that's tough to make yourself do, or you'll think you're kind of smiling, and maybe you kind of are, but it doesn't translate well on TV. I don't know if you all remember that back when George W. Bush was in office, they talked sometimes that he kind of had a smirk. And for those of you who ever maybe saw him in person, you might have realized he didn't really have a smirk. It was a smile, but it wasn't a really big smile. And on TV, it kind of came across like a smirk. So when you smile, it has to be big. It's got to be enough that people can, I don't mean you got to be grinning ear to ear the whole time, and I realize yes, there's certain topics that are not great for smiling. But you know what? Some of the most difficult or combative topics, especially on the social side, are where it's so important to smile. Because it can diffuse the anger that people are feeling. May not diffuse your opponent, may not diffuse the interviewer, but for people at home, if you're smiling, I just want people to know this because I really think it's important for them. It's going to help them. When you're smiling and you say that, people are just a little more open to listen to you. You know, and again, think about some of the more popular personalities on TV, whether it's Oprah or who. These are people with big personalities, big presence, and they smile. And I had I would say it's positive or not, but I've been around a number of these folks. When I first got into the television business, I worked for NBC. This will tell you how long ago it was. It's when David Letterman was still on NBC before he moved to CBS and retired. But David Letterman was, again, he was one of those people when he walked into the room, his energy just kind of overtook the room. And that was great for television. And a lot of people, when I've seen Oprah in person, same kind of thing. She just kind of fills the room. And most of us are just not like that. But you can copy that, not every day, but when you're doing a presentation, and that will make you more successful as an interviewer as well. Any questions about any of these elements? Yes.
I've noticed on the radio too, you can hear somebody's voice if they're smiling. It's just like when you call your mom and you can tell if she's mad at you or not, you know?
I can tell by your voice you're not happy. Yeah, no, it's totally true. It's totally true. And again, I think, this is something we all make facial expressions that we don't know we make. So, especially when you say certain words or phrases, and I would just encourage you, you can tape yourself, very easy now, set your phone up, talk to yourself. You can, and watch interviews that you do. I know it's not always pleasant, but we should do it. You can also just give your speech in front of a mirror. And you will see yourself doing things, you're like, wow, I did not know I tilted my head so much that way. Or I didn't realize that I always did this with my hands. Those are just things you don't realize until you watch it. Sometimes you'll be pleasantly surprised. You'll think, oh, it looks pretty good. There'll be other things you're like, ooh, I really should stop doing that. Yes?
Used to do a lot of political consulting, and I would talk to the candidates and say, oh, when somebody asks you this, what are you going to say? And they would always tell me, oh, well, I know that issue, I'll know what to say. And I would say, practice.
Yes.
And as you say, it is now so easy to do that you really should not ever go on into a television interview, assuming that they're not grabbing you as you come outside
right.
of your favorite bar or whatever. You have time to practice, and you should do it. And I know you all think you're going to be great, and you know how to handle it, but believe me, there is no substitute for practice.
No, it's very true. No matter in what you're saying or in how you're saying it. That's one thing. Thank you for bringing that up. It's one of the things that I did mention earlier about when you got all your elements down that you want to say, and here's the story or example I'm going to give, and all these different things. A lot of things sound great up here. The story you're going to tell, the joke you're going to tell, and then you start telling it, and you realize this is taking me 5 times as long to tell the story, or this example as I thought it was going to take. But now you're already into it, and the host is getting mad. They're trying to cut you off and you never get to it, or you're in the middle of it giving a speech and you realize that punchline doesn't really work that well there. Don't have your examples and stories be the first time you ever tell them, do it live. Try to practice saying those out loud. I mean, that's true of all your talking points and everything else, but especially examples like that, because again, a lot of things sound great here, and then you start saying it, and you're like, ooh, this didn't fill up, this didn't go as well. And you will always usually sound better the second, third, fourth time you've said something or told something than the first time you did it. So you don't want that first time to be when it's live. One thing that, men and women are different. I don't know if you all knew that. They are. We compliment, but we're different. And especially for women, I think it's important with hand gestures. Women, not everybody, but tend to be a little softer. And so the hand gestures are often softer. Guys tend to be a little firmer. So I would encourage you as a woman, you want to keep your hand gestures sharp. When you use your hands, and this is true for men too, when you use your hands, don't just have them be out there like they're there on their own. You want it to be intentional that you use them. If you're trying to make a point, you're trying to draw attention to something, that's when you want to use your hands. But they shouldn't just be kind of a separate show that's happening. And when you do use them, make sure that you're using sharp. You're keeping them firm and sharp. Any other questions on expressions and the like? Yes.
How do you smile a real smile, just forcing it?
Without forcing it?
Well,
Well,
I
what-
imagine you're forcing it if you're trying. Like, how
Well,
does it
well, when I say,
feel?
because when I say a real smile, it's because sometimes when I suggest to people, you need to smile more in your interview, they
Yeah.
just kind of smile, but it's not legit, they're just doing it because they think they should kind of be working it in. If you're positive about your message, you should be smiling about it, right? So in other words, you're not faking what you think. Supposedly what you're telling me you really believe, and you think it's going to be better for me if I go along with it, or if Congress goes along with it, or a particular community goes along. So you want to be smiling when you genuinely smiling when you say that. And again, I think it's just something you have to be cognizant of doing. It will become second nature as you do it more and more. But again, in the beginning, watch yourself and say, you know what, I thought I was smiling in that speech or that interview, and I just wasn't. And then you'll be able to work it in more.
And
Yes.
if the points you make, like if you can't find a reason to smile about a topic, maybe it's serious, but if you can't find a reason to smile about what you're trying to help people do, then your audience is definitely not going to find a reason to smile or to agree with you. So I think that, if you realize, hey, I've got this all seriousness and everyone just feels kind of depressed and not sure what to do afterwards, I've got to change some stuff because if I can't get excited, why
Why are they going to get
Yeah.
excited?
Yeah.
It's a very good point. Very good point. Anything else? Yes.
I was wondering, especially as, a woman, what would you say is, how do you appear authoritative and assertive without appearing aggressive? What would be your recommendations?
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about vocal, and that's a big way of doing it. I think keeping your gesture sharp is really important. The way you dress is important. That's true for men and women, frankly. But women can get away with being more casual than guys, because guys tend to be, if they're giving a speech or they're they're wearing a suit. That's the uniform, for better or worse. That's what you guys have. But they always have that on. And again, it depends on the realm that you're in. I mean, I'm thinking about, for example, I work in the political world in Washington. It doesn't matter what your party is, they basically all have on suits, navy blue with the red tie and the white shirt. That's just kind of the dress code. Knowing that, if I show up in something that looks like I'm going to a tea party, and I don't mean the Tea Party rallies, but an afternoon tea, that's a little more, that's frilly, or that looks like I'm going to a wedding, I don't think I'm going to look as serious oftentimes as the guy's going to look. And so I think about that. Who am I on with? Am I on with all women? Am I on with all guys? And ladies, you can use this to your advantage because you can wear a lot more color most of the time than guys can. It's just, our wardrobe has more flexibility, and you can really show up on camera. You could show up on stage. I mean, think of the State of the Union shots they do before the president comes in. And you could easily see all the female members of Congress because they're all wearing like red or blue or purple. And they do that on purpose because they really want to stand out in the crowd of navy blue and gray suits. So you can use that to your advantage as well. But, and I know people always say, well, what about Fox? How about all the women on there, how they dress? I know. Depends on who you're trying to reach and what your objective is. And sometimes it can be more appropriate than others. I think sometimes they go a little bit too far. But think about who your audience is and who the other folks you're going to be on with. Anything else on these? Yes.
On the hand gestures, wouldn't you suggest also video recording yourself so you can watch it, like Roger Ailes had his clients do?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Look, I think you should video record yourself in advance or talk to yourself in the mirror to see what all you're doing, to see how your facial expressions are, to see are you smiling, to see how are you using your hands. And then you should be doing the same thing if you do an interview or you do a speech and somebody's taping it. You should go back and watch it and see how you did it when you were actually up there live doing it.
And with somebody helping you watch it too, because you're not always going to. Because I'm sure Al Gore watched himself, but he still looks like a robot.
There's some people that are beyond help. No, I'm just kidding. That's not true. Some people are naturally better than others, but everybody can get better. And even if it's not a natural gift for you, everybody can get better. You might want to watch it by yourself first, then you can watch it with somebody else. Yeah.
And it's not the beginning and the end. George Gilder, who's a terrifically persuasive speaker, has one gesture. And this is it. Everything is always like this.
Yeah.
But it doesn't stop him from being a terrific communicator.
No, that's right. And look, and people get trademarks, I mean, Bill Clinton kind of had this thing this was his kind of hand and thumb thing. And one reason is because what you don't want to do is point at people in the audience, even though you might not mean it in a bad way, really care about you. Well, that may kind of look okay here, but on camera, it looks like I'm preaching to you, talking to you, pointing at, it just doesn't come across well. And remembering that graphic I showed about the visual, people, a lot of their decision making's on the visual, not what they actually hear the person saying. People watch TV very passively. We all do. So when they just kind of see gestures like this, they're not even really hearing what you're saying. Next time you're watching a debate on TV, whether it's a kind of talking head debate or debate of the candidates, turn down the volume and just watch the visual presentation and see who you think is winning. It's very interesting to watch because all of a sudden you're not hearing what they say, you don't know what their policies are. I mean, you know what their policies are maybe, but you don't necessarily know kind of what they're saying at the moment. It's very telling what you visually see the different people doing, how they're reacting to what somebody else is saying. And always assume the camera's on you. If people always say assume the mic is on, that's true too, but also, especially in this day and age with the phone, always assume somebody could be taking a picture of you right now. And maybe the one snarly answer you gave is the only one that everybody else outside of this room saw, even though that was 1% of what you did. You've got, people will see your front page photo on the newspaper, they'll see nothing else. So you have to always be thinking about what others are going to see. You have to say, oh, yes.
I just, I'm curious because, you look at, I watched the debate last night.
Mm-hmm.
You look at Donald Trump, and he is a pointer,
Mm-hmm.
and he uses very large gestures, and yet it seems to play out okay for him.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, is he just an anomaly there because it,
Well, there's I think you can really break the rules and make it work for you. And I think Donald Trump's a great example of that. Not just in his pointing and big, all over the place, Jeff, that's one of them, but even what he says. And this guy's a loser. And you're like, oh, I can't believe he said that, that's why you're at the end of the state. He just says stuff that other people maybe kind of be thinking, and then he just, whoa. But that's working for him because it's so out of bounds. The problem, I think, is, and I'm not suggesting anybody go out and do that. So, that worked for him, I'm going to use that myself. But I think the challenge is when you're in the, he's purposefully doing it. If you're going to do it, purposefully do it. Don't do it just because you kind of forgot and you started pointing at people. You want to make sure that you don't just fall into bad habits because you didn't think about it. But yeah, there are times you can break the rules and it works beautifully. All right, let me talk a little bit about, and I'm happy to answer if any other questions after. We've talked a little bit about this already, so I'll go over it briefly. With accessories and the like, and this is more for women because we tend to wear more jewelry, but guys, same thing. You want to keep things very, very simple. You want people focused on what you're saying, not trying to figure out where they buy that and where those earrings come from. I love his tie, and those are all nice things, but you're actually wanting them to remember what you said. And so if you have things that are distracting to people, a lot of people wear pins. Members of Congress wear pins. But people that are with different groups will wear things representing, he's got a pin on, you can see here. People will be sitting at home, and I bet some of you have done this, where you're like, what is that? What is that? I can't tell what that is. And you're not listening to what they're saying. My mother does this to me all the time. We'll be watching something, she's like, did you see the scarf she had? I'm like, no, I'm trying to listen to this right now. But that's just what most people do. They get distracted very easily by something that catches their eye. Jewelry that moves around a lot, and maybe because you really like the earrings, but now I'm focused on that as opposed to focused on what they're saying. You want to look good, but you don't want to be distracting to people. Same thing goes when you're talking about like the patterns that you wear. Like stripes here, that would be fine under a jacket, but I wouldn't suggest wearing like stripes on TV for two reasons. One, it can be distracting to the audience. Solid is better, but it's also distracting to the cameras, especially stripes and small patterns, checks. Especially if there's a lot of contrast, black and white, red and white, things that have a lot of contrast. You've probably seen sometimes like a guy's tie or jacket kind of move. It looks like it's vibrating on TV. The camera's just having a hard time getting a really sharp focus on that. So solid is just better. Whether it's patterns, whether it's tie, colors, solid is just better. Cameras, though, having said that, are great these days. I used to tell people, don't ever wear white on TV. I don't say that anymore. I still think you have to be careful. You can look like you're glowing at times. Blue's a great color. Corals are great colors. Jewel tone. For those of you who saw the debate last night, what Carly had on the arena was a good color. And that's true for men as well. things like yellows and kind of bright pastels, they tend to kind of get washed out a little bit on TV. So there are not as many do's and don'ts, I feel like, as there used to be, but when in doubt, kind of fall back on the standard pieces. And then I mentioned again, remembering the mic factor. If I was here today and they were going to mic me, I'd need to have a place to put the mic. Now again, for most of the time for guys, you've got a jacket on, you can hide the backpack here, it's the battery pack, and it's fine. A lot of times with ladies, you've got a dress on where there's nowhere to hide it. Now, they'll drop the cord down your dress and hook the mic back here and so forth, but you want to be cognizant of that. If you had something else that was easier to mic, you might have chosen to wear that if you knew that was going to be what you were walking into. So just keep that in mind. Any questions about wardrobe? One thing I didn't mention, which I will, is I don't think showing a lot of skin is great. So when I go back to the thing about people when they didn't know what they were going to be sitting either in front of or behind, it's like a desk, and you see a woman sits down in a dress, and all of a sudden the dress that was here is now up to here. It just doesn't look good. And for guys, when your socks fall down and you can see this much skin between your pants and your socks, that is bad. It's just and not only does it look tacky, it's just distracting. And then everybody's talking about the socks. So, okay, let's talk about voice. One of the things that I think people can do to make themselves sound stronger, but also to be very helpful to their audience and helping their audience remember what they say, is to pause before and after the main things you want people to remember. Because the reason being is it draws people into what you're saying and it gives them time to remember it. You think about when you're hearing a speech, and I'm not going to be the least bit offended if it's happened here today, you tune out. We all do it. You're sitting there, like, oh, you start thinking about what you got to do at 4 o'clock, and and then you kind of come back in. One way to help your audience come back in at the most important times is if you pause, because silence kind of refocuses people. I don't mean you have to do the Benjamin Netanyahu thing at the UN. Did you all see that 2 weeks ago? That was extremely effective. That was a great use of pausing. So he spoke at the UN, and he was talking about how none of the members there had stood up on the Iran nuclear deal. And I forgot the exact question that he asked. Does anybody remember what he asked? Basically, it's like, do you know what this will do for my country? And he just sits there. He stops, and he just starts looking at everybody eye to eye. It's complete silence for 40 seconds. It was dramatic, to say the least.
With his eyes especially, he's just like staring you down.
Yeah, he was staring. You're like,
he was looking for people.
Yeah, I'll get you after this. But it was very powerful. Now, I'm not suggesting you go that far, but if you pause, people kind of refocus, say your main point, and then pause again. And that gives people time to restate it in their head, which gives them a much better chance they're actually going to remember it. You can say something great, and people go, oh yeah, that's really good, but then you move on to the next point. You don't give people time to compute it. They're just computed. They just keep following right along with you. So pausing before and after is helpful for your audience. It's also helpful in an interview where a reporter's going to go back and excerpt out part of your sound bites. If you make their job easy, there's a much better chance they're going to use what you wanted. So if you pause before and after your main kind of talking point, you make it really easy for them to take that out. If you talk a mile a minute for 30 seconds, and they've got to find the best 7 seconds to edit before and after, and they kind of just do it where you take a breath. I mean, sometimes they're not out to get you. People often think, oh, the media, they're just trying to find the worst soundbite of what I said. Sometimes you gave it to them. A, because you shouldn't have said it, or 2, because that just was the easiest thing for them to edit out. So make their job easier, and you'll have a much better job of them picking what you would have wanted. Similarly to all of this, slow down. Not everybody talks a mile a minute, but some of us, I'm guilty of this myself, will really get going. And even if you can articulate really well, even though you may speak fast, but you don't jump on all your words, you still don't give your audience time to really think about what you're saying. So just slow down. And that's also helpful, especially if you get nervous. If you speak more calmly, more slowly, it can help you maintain control of your own composure and not start jumping and falling on top of your words. Keep up your energy level. This is something that's very true in speaking, but it's also true in an interview. And radio, we were talking about earlier, is a perfect example. People sometimes do radio and they think, well, nobody's watching, so they're kind of kicked back at their desk like this, doing a radio interview. people can sense that. They may not know you're kicked back at your desk, but I will often stand and walk and talk when I'm doing a radio interview because I just have more energy that way. They can absolutely hear if you're smiling or not. You can just tell. So the same gestures that you would use and vocal that you would use on television, or if somebody was sitting right in front of you, you probably should do that when you do a radio interview as well. And on voice, when I talk about keeping up your energy level, one other point I want to make there is, especially in speaking, people will often start strong with a sentence and they'll end low, right? Or you've seen people do a speech like this, they're like, the most important thing that you can know today is that marriage is between a man and a woman. I mean, I'm making something up right now. But they end their main point looking down at the podium, right? If I say, what I really want you to remember today is something that we did called the OBIT test that really helps you know, here's what your audience needs to hear. And I finished my sentence looking straight down. That's not effective. You want to finish your sentence looking at your audience members. And that's true visually, it's important to do, but also from a vocal point, you want to keep your energy up at the beginning of your sentence. And then finally, on tone. There are a lot of things about an interview or a debate or a speech that you can't control. You can't control what the other people say. Last night, I know there were people that were not happy with the moderators of the debate, but you agreed to be on stage, now you're there, they're going to say what they're going to say. You can't control those things. What you can control is your own tone. And once you lose that, you usually have lost the debate. When somebody, when they kind of keep nudging at you and you finally take the bait and you get mad and that comes across, or you get really defensive, that's what you want to stay away from. Stay in charge of your own emotions, if you will. That may drive, and sometimes that will really drive the other side crazy because they're trying really hard to get you to lose it and you're not going there. So tone is one of the main things that we control. Any questions else otherwise on voice here? It's important to punch key words. I mean, this is something I used earlier when I was doing the 30, 60, 10 sound bites. Not all words are equal in terms of what you're wanting people to remember. So for example, in this particular one, I pulled out the words I really wanted to hit if I were giving the speech, the ones I would give a little more punch to that I would want people to remember. And again, you're not going to do that for every speech, but it can be helpful to underline or highlight something you're like, I really want to punch this when I say it, just as a reminder to yourself to help your audience remember the most important elements. On tone and speed, and this goes back to the emotion side, the way you convey something conveys a different emotion. So if you're talking loudly, you're probably conveying that you're angry or that you're outraged about something. If you're speaking in a softer tone, that's going to convey more compassion, sympathy for the issue or the person that you're talking to. If you're talking really fast, that can really convey excitement and enthusiasm. And then finally, if you're talking in a much more slow manner, you just come across calmer. And it also can show that you may not be agreeing with something, but you're understanding of where the other side is. Most of the time, your presentation should incorporate at least 2 of these, maybe 3. You may not want to get angry at every presentation. There are times, though, when anger is right, outrage is right. But no speech should be just one of those. Rarely should a 5-minute interview be just one of those. You want to think about how am I using these different things to convey different parts of my message. And we are getting near the end. Transition. One of the things that I work with people on, especially when they're doing interviews, is if a reporter calls you up to do an interview with you, or you're going to go on a show, supposedly they're having you on because you're an expert on either one side of it or both sides of whatever it happens to be. They're having you on to give your take on something. So you should never feel guilty about coming to say what you know is most important for your audience to hear. Sometimes reporters are great and they know what questions to ask and really get you to the right place. But sometimes they don't know. They may be somebody who covers a zillion topics and this is just thrown on their desk at the last minute. And it's not that they don't want to help you, they just don't know what questions to ask. You can't rely on them to ask you the right questions. You cannot rely on your debate partner to go where you want to go either. They may try to go in all different directions. So what I have here, what I call transition phrases, I'm sure you've heard a lot of folks use these if you watch political shows, that help keep you going back to the points that you want to make. So it doesn't matter what topic or what question the interviewer may ask, you can say, look, there's a lot of things we can talk about here, but my main concern is this. Or equally important to that is that, and you keep going back to one of those 3 points that you had around the pyramid, this is how you keep getting back to those as opposed to just answering the question that's put in front of you. Yes?
How do you balance this with not being another example of the running joke that a politician
Never
never
answers your question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like where you say, well, I actually did want to know the answer to that, but you never actually answered that.
Right. What I usually suggest is there's nothing wrong with answering a question that may not be one of your main talking points if it's not going to take you in the wrong direction or it's not a gotcha question.
Okay.
If it's a gotcha question, I don't go there. And if it's going to lead us way off in a different direction, I don't want to go there. But if it's a, how many people, look, yeah, there's about 55% of people who are doing this, but I think here's what people need to understand. And I go back into my main points. So it's not that you're trying to be rude and not answer questions, but if you're not very careful, that is all you will end up doing. And then you, again, that's when you walk off the set or you leave the interview and you're like, none of the questions were bad, but I didn't make any of the points I wanted to make because you just answered the questions. And so, you know, usually a good reporter is going to help you. I mean, it's going to ask some good questions, but it just doesn't always happen. And your job isn't just to answer questions. Your job is there to communicate to people and say, here's what you got to know about this. There's a lot of things we can talk about, but the main issue at stake today is this. Forget all this other nonsense, focus on this. And you can say that, and people say, well, what about when the interviewer asks you the same question like 3 times? I've been in those situations. I say, look, I know you want to talk about this, but I know it's more important than, and, you know, you want to get an answer here, but here's what I know that my constituents need to know. Or here's what I happen to know as somebody who's followed this issue is the most important thing for the American public or for the people of Utah or wherever it is to focus on. So I'm going to go back there. And usually that different, they quit asking it. And speaking of staying on it, I'm sure some of you have noticed sometimes when you're watching TV, that like the same car commercial will run either back to back, or a commercial will run, then another car, then the same commercial will come on. Have you ever noticed that? That's not a mistake. Sometimes people go, oh, they just got the tapes mixed up back there, or they pushed the wrong button. No, they do that on purpose. And sometimes that can be annoying to the audience member. You'll finally run that commercial again. I've seen this like 10 times. Because the first time you saw the commercial, you didn't remember it. And now you may be slightly annoyed, but chances are if you're looking for a new car, you're going to remember that car and not the other stuff that you've been seeing. I mean, Madison Avenue has spent a lot of money figuring out what makes people buy things and what makes people do things. We don't have to re-spend all that money to figure a lot of it out. And a lot of it is repetition. A lot of it people hear until it breaks through. And remembering, you know, that you may be focused on something and you and your friends or you and the folks at your office talk a lot about this issue all the time. It's really good every once in a while to get in a place where that's not what people do and hear not only how they talk about it, but just how little they know about it. And that if you aren't somebody who really repeats your message a lot, you're never going to break through all the clutter. And I think this is almost more true now than it's ever been with all the different places that you can go to get information, all the stuff that's thrown at people. I remember back when MSNBC first started and all the news channels were getting going. CNN was on, but Saturday Night Live did a skit, and it was they had like the news anchor on MSNBC, you know, reading the news. And up here like popped the weather report, you know, like sunny, little sun, 66 degrees, whatever. And then, you know, down here came like the stock ticker. And then all of a sudden it was like, you know, somebody's, you know, obviously had their name on it. And then whatever they were talking about, there was a picture. And the next thing you knew, the news anchor was like dodging all the graphics on the screen. And they were making fun of how these news channels were putting everything up. Well, now that's no longer a joke. That's what they do, right? I mean, it's all over. But that's what people are used to seeing. So it's harder and harder to focus on what somebody's saying because there's so much other stuff going on around it. And that's just one example of the clutter that we have to sort through to get to information. So repeating is definitely important. A few interview tips when you're sitting down with a reporter. First, don't ever bother to ask an interviewer to repeat or clarify their question. Sometimes you're just needing more time to think about what you want to say, your answer. But don't try to figure out what they're trying to get to. You just say, well, could you clarify what you're really asking here. Because sometimes they'll just kind of ask a mumbled, jumbled question, and you try to throw in an answer to it. Don't ever be afraid to ask them to clarify it. Second, don't answer for others or other organizations. I'm sure you've seen where they'll say, oh, candidate so-and-so just said this, it'll be some outrageous statement they made, and they want you to comment on it now. That's not your job. Or some other organization, maybe there was some scandal that went on, they want you to comment on it. And maybe one of your ally, organizations. They're dealing with that, I'll let them comment on that. I'm here to talk about X. Or if it's a candidate or another person, they can speak to that. I can only speak for, our organization, da, da, da. Don't get into trying to answer for other people and other organizations. And then finally, once you've given an answer in an interview, you can stop talking. This is one of the biggest mistakes I think most people make. They will give a great answer, and the interviewer just sits there. Now, this doesn't happen much on live TV because they needed to keep moving along, But in a sit-down interview, whether it's a print reporter or a TV reporter, and they're going to go back and just take excerpts, they'll ask you a question, you give a great answer, and they'll just go, oh. And they'll kind of shake their head. And people feel the need to add to it. Then they go, oh, I'm going to say something else again. Now, sometimes nothing bad happens. You just kind of add to it, and the only negative there is you've kind of cluttered what you already gave them, the good stuff, and now you give them more to work with, which you don't want to do. You just want to give them the good stuff. Other times, that's where people make, especially with politicians, that's where they start talking and they start saying things they didn't really come there to say. And all of a sudden it gets really interesting. And then the reporter's like, oh, let's go over here, So but that's a trick reporters will use. They'll just kind of, oh. Or they'll ask a question, is there anything else you want to add to that? I've asked all my questions, is there anything else you want to add? And people feel again that, oh, I got to come up with another answer. You don't have to come up with another answer. Or that's an opportunity to restate something you've already said, you just want to say it again, well, that's fine. But don't feel the need to come up with a new talking point, a new stat that you're going to use. I would urge you just to stop once you've given your answer. And finally, the very last, either sound effect, practice, practice, and practice. Because people will often say, well, how do you ever get rid of the butterflies? Do you ever get rid of doing this? I don't think you ever completely get rid of it, and I actually would hope in some ways you don't, because when you have a little bit of nervous energy, that can be a really good thing. It gives you a little more energy. We talked about the importance of having energy earlier. But you don't want to be so energetic that you're a nervous wreck. And the only way to really get past that is the more you do it, the better you will get, and the easier the words will come. And this is true for people who, I used to do a lot of spokesman type work 10 years ago and kind of went out of that for a while and was doing a lot more internal management stuff. I'm now back into that arena again, and I will tell you, I was rusty. Going back and doing a show wasn't as easy as it used to be. Things didn't kind of come quite as quickly. And part of that was I just hadn't done it in a while. So I had to just kind of start repracticing again, and then it starts coming faster, it comes easier. But that's true of public speaking, any presentation you give. You'll get better at giving short answers, telling things in simpler ways. The more you do it, it's easier to get rid of extra words. The more you say it out loud, you'll go, I don't need to say that anymore. I don't have to tell that part of the story. I don't need that part of the description. But you don't know that until you verbally say it.